So I wanted to make a video about the 1973 Mr. Olympia competition. Now, the reason I wanted to make a video about the 1973 Olympia is because this is the year that the rivalry between Arnold and Sergio Oliva came to an end. So up until 1973, Arnold and Schwarzenegger were pretty consistent rivals, and they were going head-to-head consistently every year. But 73 would be the first year that they wouldn't go head-to-head at the Olympia, and they wouldn't go head-to-head again from that point forward. So the placings of the 1973 Mr. Olympia were as follows. Serge Nubret got third place, Franco Columbu got second, and Arnold Schwarzenegger got fourth. And this will be Arnold Schwarzenegger's fourth consecutive Mr. Olympia win, and that broke Sergio Oliva's previous record of 3. Now, Sergio was originally scheduled to compete at this year's Olympia, but he was banned from competing by the IFBB for appearing in the 1972 WBBG Mr. Galaxy contest. And I'm going to get to that in a minute and elaborate on that whole situation. But this is not the first time Sergio Oliva was banned from competing. If you guys remember the 1971 Mr. Olympia a couple of years prior, that was the first year that the IFBB started their non-sanctioned policy, and Sergio was banned from that competition for competing in the NABBA Mr. Universe. So there's a couple things playing into Sergio not being allowed to compete, and a lot of people look back throughout history and say, well, you know, maybe Joe Weider was a little racist, maybe he had it in for Sergio, and maybe he put these rules in place specifically to prevent Arnold from being beaten by Sergio, and he wanted to hold Sergio back from winning all these Olympias. And there's a lot of conspiracy theorists out there that believe that was the case, and that Joe Weider did have it in for Sergio, and Sergio was kind of a marked man because Joe wanted Arnold to be the new poster boy of bodybuilding, and he was pushing Arnold so hard. And he didn't want Sergio to be a threat to Arnold's flawless little reign that he was going to have for the next couple of years, and come back in 1980 and win again. So a lot of people think that they kind of had it in for Sergio. So earlier in the video, I referenced something called the Tijuana incident. So this is an incident that happened, was at a competition called the Mr. International Azteca competition. This is a competition that Sergio Oliva was competing in, and Arnold Schwarzenegger and Joe Weider were in the audience watching. So basically there was no other bodybuilders that were even in the same ballpark as Sergio competing in this competition, and he basically blew them all away. So Schwarzenegger and Weider were in the audience, and from the stage, Sergio called out Arnold Schwarzenegger and said he wanted to pose down on stage between the two of them, and he wanted Arnold to come on stage and have some real competition. So Weider was telling Arnold to ignore him and not to go up there. So Arnold never ended up going on stage, but eventually Franco Columbu ended up accepting Sergio's invitation. Franco got on stage and competed against him, and the promoter of the show raised both their arms and declared the competition a draw. So shortly after this competition, this was when Sergio was banned from competing in the 1973 Olympia. So the reason they actually stated was that it was because of this Mr. Galaxy contest, which they claimed was only a couple days before this Mr. International Azteca competition, where Sergio was calling out Arnold. But actually that Mr. Galaxy was over a year prior to this incident, so Joe Weider had plenty of time to disqualify Sergio from the 1973 Olympia between 72 when he competed in the Galaxy and then this show in Tijuana. So they kind of used that as an excuse, but really the real reason was Joe Weider was pissed off that Sergio was calling out Arnold, combined with the fact that this was at a rival promoter's organization. So this was Dan Laurie's organization, and this guy was a major rival to Weider, and there's all kinds of stuff that went on between the two of them. And I'm going to make some videos about that in the future between Dan Laurie, the promoter, and Joe Weider, the promoter. There's some good stories about that. But really, the real reason was they were pissed off that he was kind of taunting Arnold. He was taunting Joe Weider, pissed Joe Weider off, and then they banned him from the Olympia. So the 1973 Olympia is just another example of all these early Olympias where there was a whole bunch of politics involved and there was a whole bunch of crazy stuff going on. But really, if we get back to the actual Olympia itself, the main reason I wanted to make a video about it is the fact that Arnold Schwarzenegger really had, arguably some of the best conditioning of his entire bodybuilding career at that year's Olympia. So some people say 1974 was the year Arnold was the biggest and most muscular. Then 1973 was the year he was the most jacked and shredded and ripped and had the best conditioning of his career. And if you look at some of these photos, I tend to agree with that. He had definitely sized down a little bit, but he looked tremendous. He looked very, very conditioned, very, very good. So 73, most conditioned. 74, his biggest, and arguably some people say that 71 was his best year. He had the best balance of size and conditioning. So 73 is a very important year in bodybuilding in terms of Arnold Schwarzenegger's career and in terms of Sergio Oliva getting screwed. So let me know in the comment section below what you guys think of Sergio Oliva getting screwed at the 1973 Olympia. '73 Mr. Olympia, specifically Arnold Schwarzenegger's physique at that Olympia. And this would be the year that Arnold Schwarzenegger would actually break Sergio Oliva's record of winning 3 Olympias, and this would be Arnold's 4th Olympia win, winning in 1970, 71, 72, and of course that year in 1973. So specifically the 1973 Olympia, I believe, is Arnold Schwarzenegger's most shredded physique that he ever brought to the Olympia stage. Now, the following year in 1974, most people would argue that 1974 was the biggest physique that Arnold ever brought to the Olympia stage. Many say 1974 is the only time that Arnold was over 250 pounds on stage. But in 73, we saw the most shredded and arguably the best version of Arnold that we had ever seen. Everything about Arnold at this Olympia was just completely on point. Arnold wasn't really known for having the best legs. He never has been. But in 1973, his conditioning was so good that the separation in his legs was amazing. And you got to keep in mind, the legs back in the 70s weren't like the legs that we see today. So the separation that Arnold had in his legs in 1973 was really a groundbreaking level of leg separation, especially from the front. So I think the front double bicep pose tells a lot of the story about Arnold's conditioning in 1973, but I think probably the best pose is this pose you're looking at here, the most muscular pose from 1973. This pose right here really exemplifies how conditioned Arnold really was. The striations in the pecs, arguably better than we've ever seen from Arnold, just deep, crazy striations in the pecs. The shoulders crazy striated. And I would also say that from a vascularity standpoint, this could be the most vascular version of Arnold Schwarzenegger that we've ever seen. Just look at the thickness and the deepness of the veins that you can see in his biceps in that most muscular pose. Probably the thickest his veins have ever been and the most that they've ever stood out was in 1973. Now, a couple interesting facts about the 1973 Mr. Olympia. Number one would be the fact that Sergio Oliva was originally scheduled to compete, but this was a show that he was actually disqualified from or barred from competing by the IFBB for competing in a rival organization known as the WBBG, or the World Bodybuilding Guild. And this was a promotion done by Dan Laurie, who was one of the biggest rivals to Joe Weider. So in 1972, Sergio Oliva competed in the WBBG Mr. Galaxy competition. And this was after the IFBB had implemented their non-sanction policy in 1991. So 1991 was the year that the IFBB said, okay, if you guys want to compete in other organizations, that's fine. But if you do so, you won't be able to compete at the Olympia. You can only be an IFBB pro bodybuilder. You can't be a pro bodybuilder in other organizations. The IFBB is it. So we could have seen Arnold and Sergio go head-to-head in 73, but we actually didn't. So there was only 3 competitors at the 1973 Mr. Olympia. You had Arnold Schwarzenegger, Franco Columbu, and of course, Serge Nubret. And another interesting fact about the 1973 Mr. Olympia was this was one of the few years in bodybuilding where the prize money for the Olympia actually dropped from the previous year. So in 1972, the prize money was $1,000. Then it would drop $250 down to $750 in 1973. So as we know, Arnold Schwarzenegger won that show. Franco would take second, and Serge Nubret would take the 3rd place spot. So again, in my opinion, 1973 was one of the most shredded physiques that Arnold ever brought. He had that hard, but grainy and dense, crazy muscle that was just super shredded, unlike anything we had ever seen from Arnold before. Arnold was typically known for coming in big and in some cases coming in soft, especially in those early Mr. Universe competitions that he won throughout the 60s. But at this particular show, we saw Arnold like we had never seen him before, extremely ripped and extremely hard, and just striations and veins all over. So in my opinion, 1973, the most conditioned Arnold we ever saw. Let me know in the comment section below what you guys think. What year was Arnold's most conditioned physique? Please give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it.